Welcome to the Institute of World Culture, a nonprofit educational institute dedicated to lifelong learning in the promotion of universal brotherhood. The Institute is located in Santa Barbara, California, but is now also streaming events online at our YouTube channel, IWC in Santa Barbara. My name is Carolyn Dorrance, and I will start off as chair, but my co-chair is Maurice Bisheff. Information regarding the Institute can be found on its website, worldculture.org, and in the monthly newsletter. Copies are on the back table. You can sign up to receive the newsletter and all other notifications by emailing jerry@worldculture.org. And you'll find, copies given out here. For those of you in Concord Hall, masks are optional, and there are restrooms to your right. A special welcome to those of you who are new to the Institute, and again, you can find out more about us by looking through the blue brochure, the website, or the back table. The 10 aims of the Institute are articulated in the Declaration of Interdependence, and they provide a foundation for all Institute programs. They are posted on the website and printed in the blue brochure on the back table. The program today is International Politics, Transnational Economics, Environmental Crisis, Ethical and Sustainable Choices. Particularly relevant is aim number 8.
Aim number 8 of the Declaration of Interdependence: to examine changing social structures in terms of the principle that a world culture is greater than the sum of its parts, and to envision the conditions, prospects, and possibilities of the world civilization of the future.
We each will be offering some insights. We might mention that when this title and this program was first envisioned, we put it as the opening program for the year in early January. But as you might remember, we got rained out. And our vision was that we would give very modest presentations and leave at least an hour for you, the participants, the attendees, to ask questions and make contributions on these very important topics. So we decided not to have slides, but just to run through a number of topics that you might find relevant to today. So there will be an opportunity for question and discussion at the end, so please hold on to your questions. Maurice Bisheff has been a longtime member and contributor to the Institute of World Culture. He is very, very well informed of current affairs, and his specialty was public administration. He got his formal education at California State University, Northridge, and his PhD at the University of Southern California. I have also been around at the Institute. I was one of those who was first in the discussion committee trying to shape a vision. He came to California to finish my doctoral work at UCSB, and I was totally fortunate to be able to take philosophy of courses of various sorts, social, logic, metaphysics, from the co-founders of the Institute, Professors Raghavan and Nandini Iyer. My main focus has been in political and social philosophy, also constitutional law, and international relations. So I guess you'd call me a generalist of some sort. But we've given fresh thought to some of these, what you might initially see as boring topics, but we hope that you will find that they're not boring topics. The first thing we'll kind of look at, and so we're going to do it back and forth and try to be clear in what we have to say. We live in a world of nation states, and that's sometimes a benefit and sometimes a source of chaos and conflict. A state is an organization exercising government authority over people and territory defined by borders. It's usually seen as seeking status and stability, but also some enlargement of its governing capacity. The word state has a Roman origin, and so that's where Rome, after it began to conquer new territories, it needed some way to organize all the people it was conquering. And the setting up states seemed to be a way to do that. States claim sovereignty and territorial integrity. If you listen hard to the news and the discussion about the Ukrainian war, you'll probably hear that word territorial integrity being drawn up from the past. States were an alternative to feudalism, which emerged after the fall of the Roman Empire in mid-6th century BC, Common Era, and remained kind of a pretty undefined area for over 1,000 years. The typical characteristics of a state are to have a central supreme authority, such as a king or a shah, to have a bureaucracy that could provide expertise and administer law and plan for the use of resources, which were increasingly coming to European societies after global trade with Asia developed in the 15th century. States have formal lawmaking provisions. They're not necessarily democratic or representative, but they did find it necessary to have a legal system and a defined judicial system, replacing the private courts of the feudal system. It invokes obligation of citizens and punishment, and eventually will create the title of citizen. It puts together a professional military and police with a monopoly of coercive power developed and used, as we're seeing today in places like Iran or Russia. A state, through its central authority, develops foreign policy and relations. It's an alternative to imperialism and colonialism, which developed very much in the last 2,000 years, but it can be an instrument of tyranny and conquest. For understanding the modern state, we can look really at the past 600 years. From its nebulous development as early as the 1300s to the present day. It is seen as the model for a state were really the French monarchies, particularly the kingship of Louis the 16th and 18th. The French monarchy did not survive, but it had very much and pioneered in those characteristics we've just gone through. it may seem as a kind of relic of the past where we're beyond states, but there now are 193 member states in the United Nations. That's quite a jump from the 51 states that were part of the Organization of the United Nations in 1947. The new states came into being as empires began to collapse in the beginning of the 20th century, and by the outbreak of World War II, the conflicts and aggression of states was pretty obvious and created, as we'll go into a little bit later, the desire by some very brilliant people to find some way to rein in states and subject them to international rules. A nation is a large group of people with shared values and aims. They have a culture that they share. Tom Paine recognized America as a nation. That was kind of an innovation that had evolved and therefore a distinct identity and therefore deserved independence from Great Britain. He could not see how the American nation could fit into the British nation, which he was very familiar with, having been born and suffered injustice there. The criteria for a nation might be language, ethnicity, lifestyle, religion. It began to rise as a political force in the 19th century, often as an alternative to empires like the Habsburg Empire. And so nations like Hungary and Poland, they began to see themselves differently, and we had then being part of a great big empire, and they were just a weak part of it. There's a great diversity in nationalism. It could be seen as ebbing and being replaced by something called populism. But in both terms suggests that the people and what they value and what they will be loyal to need to be part of a state to make it strong and to reinforce the legitimacy of its government. So we have emerging by the beginning of the 20th century a pretty sharp understanding of what a nation state is. These states, over the decades, over the centuries, began to communicate with each other, and in some cases have wars with each other, or engage in negotiation over the use of resources like a river, and create agreements, or what were sometimes called conventions. And so we have international relations. And it was a very open-ended but important development to bring some sort of stability to large areas like Europe. In this international relations, it was first, kind of developing maybe a treaty with your neighbor over passage through it and trade agreements, things like that. But it also began to be used first by the Portuguese and then the Spanish and all as ways of establishing relationships with rulers far away. So there was very international development. There's a story how the British sent an ambassador to negotiate with the Chinese government in the 17th century, and the Chinese government wouldn't let him in, and he had to wait. He waited a long time, and they finally let him in and agreed to negotiate with him in some way. Now, we mentioned that the state has survived as a model of political organization. And it has, particularly in organized institutions like conferences or UN debates, seem to be a block to progress. And that loyalty to states, even recognition that there is a state, has ebbed. But meanwhile, a new reality has developed. And that is transnationalism. And we both want to speak to what transnationalism is. It's a new term for a new reality, namely that people, organizations, foundations, corporations have initiated in the last 40 years a variety of activities and instruments all over the world that are not initiated or controlled by governments. So kind of think that one through. And this reality, as we hope to show, has become very broad and very important. And it allows, as we've said, for individuals and organizations to initiate activity on the world plane above the level of governments and international politics. It's sometimes referred to as civil society, although it is in one way private and non-governmental. Governments may have some minimal influence, for instance, requiring approval to entry and approval of activities. A group wants to build a railroad or a port, or it wants to set up a school. Missionaries were some of the first to kind of knock on the door and say, we'd like to come in and set up a school, and sometimes they were allowed to. So the requirement of passports and transit visas, which is still needed, reflect the sovereignty of the state. And every once in a while you hear a reference to sovereignty, the claim of supreme, ultimate, final authority within the boundaries or the borders of that state. Transnational activity shows immense diversity, economic, political, educational, missionary or religious, cultural, humanitarian. We should also mention just plain ideological, like Communist Party or groups had a conference in 1923, we think, to discuss how they could spread communism all over the world. And that, of course, rang bells of alarm in other quarters. But so there's different types. Some are involved in economic activities such as investment, banking, manufacturing, infrastructure, and trade. And Maurice is going to talk about that. We remember reading a book in the early 70s. We can't remember the author's name, but he was mapping out how automobiles now are built from parts that are built in different countries. So it might be a half dozen countries, a battery, the steering apparatus, or whatever it is, they're built in different countries and then assembled in one place. So you have a kind of a world car. You have organizations like the World Bank realizing it couldn't just talk to or work with fellow bankers. It had to go out and connect with the people that they were actually trying to invest in. So their website became a fascinating illustration of, farmers in India or wherever setting up enterprises with the funding coming from an international organization. Communication with new technology has definitely supported transnationalism. Radio, TV, movies, internet, cell phones, you name it. And we've all engaged to some extent, and we would think benefited from this transnational communication, which some states try to shut down or restrict. But it's very hard to actually do that. And of course, there's also just travel. And the jet airplane of the 1950s started obviously at a capacity for easy travel, fast travel, and so that would help international businesses, it would help all kinds of organizations. There is, of course, tourism. There's doing business in the air while you're flying from one place to another. So that's a factor. It's a very big factor in making people aware of other countries, other people, and bringing into a state perhaps individuals that doesn't really want to have there, but they may be able to get through the airport anyway. Transnationalism is very much at work in educational experience, both formal and informal. It is quite significant, the number of students who are going abroad to study from the United States, as well as those who are coming. We remember being surprised when at the beginning of the recent war, or the ongoing war in Ukraine, one of the first groups to be evacuated from danger from the war were students from India. And who would ever thought that there were Indian students in Ukraine? But there were. And you can find all kinds of matches. German universities have accepted large numbers of people from Africa, as has Russia. So that has a long-term effect. And then there's just informal contacts, meeting people from other states. And all of us have had that experience. And then you could bring in the whole process of education through just immigration or refugee experience. Transnationalism is flourishing at the level of global cultural activities. It's taken for granted that symphonies, dance groups, the Beatles, and other pop groups can move from country to country and give concerts and become very much part of the popular culture that the younger generation identifies with. And so they become, that's another way in which loyalties and receptivity to what's happening elsewhere does indeed develop. We were very struck by learning about, and now it's gone on for about 9-10 years, the singing competition in Europe, where each country can put forth a group that on a given day, it's usually, I think, just took place in the spring, and they compete to be the winners, to be the best singing group in Europe. Well, that's transnational. And even though Ukraine won it last year and therefore could host it under the rules, they weren't in a position to, and so it was put on, I believe, in Scotland or Liverpool or someplace back home. Global conferences such as environmental meetings, professional associations. What UCSB professor hasn't been to some conference held overseas and meted and greeted and learned from people from other countries, and that may promote future contacts. Sports. Now it's very common for a soccer team to have some player, it's not from their own, where it's maybe the Belgian team, but it might have somebody from Africa as part of, or a coach on their, in part of their team effort. So you can't assume that the team that is put forth in a particular country only has people from that country. They may be from all other sorts of places, and that gives opportunity for very talented athletes who come from different countries, and this is true in tennis, to have an opportunity to fully maximize their talent. Medical and health exchanges, including responses to global pandemics. Yesterday's news interviewed a doctor from Syria. He got his education there, but then he moved to the United States, has lived and practiced here for several years, but he's organized a medical NGO that goes into disaster areas such as Syria and Turkey with a team of trained volunteers. And he very much explained how they operate. And of course, we've seen thousands of volunteers going to help with the disaster, and often they are more trained, better able to do what they need to do than the local department. The movement of refugees and immigrants is certainly very much part of transnational reality. And you see people walking from Greece to Germany, and what route can they take? I don't know how any of us could walk from Greece to Germany, but if you're motivated enough, so just to get to where you might be able to settle down and make new routes, you have to engage in transnationalism and hope that you don't encounter fences. And finally, the spread of religions and religious ideas, that's been part of transnationalism. And whether it's a missionary group trying to set up something in another country and maybe getting permission to stay there, there's also the informal spread. So now we're coming into contact with Muslims. And initially there was, well, what's Islam all about? We have individuals from this country who once there was contact with Indian religions and yoga, off they went. And some wanted to stay and some just wanted to learn what's Buddhism all about, or Hinduism, or last week we had a talk, 2 weeks ago we had a talk on Neo-Confucianism. And so there's a transnational encounter, so to speak. So if you wanted to really understand where the world is going, you might give a commitment to once a month discover somewhere a transnational activity or a transnational organization. And you can make a list and you could send us that list, because it's something that we're very much there. So the basic point is the creation and influence of a transnational reality. It's something that's appeared, developed, something new, not completely. There are always individuals who took a journey to Tibet or wherever. Thousands of volunteers, in fact, some say millions of volunteers, have created this new reality. They seek the freedom to act, to serve, to learn, and their actions reflect imagination and creativity. They develop transnational knowledge and loyalty. They expand cultural awareness, and universal values are discovered. And we begin to hear more references to humanity, humanitarian, humanism, replaces references to nationalism. You probably, maybe within yourself or heard others, well, I don't want to just say I'm an American. I'm a member of humanity, and it's humanity that we need to think about. And we also are thinking about becoming citizens of the world, that this is the kind of citizenship that I can embrace. We might mention that citizenship was kind of added to the nation state concept and reality back in the 18th century, when the American founders were putting together a constitution after they had won independence. They had one problem they had is, well, what do we do about women? because we're not going to make them voters or participants in the political system. But if we just leave them without any identity, you might say, in this new republic, that might be kind of a danger. So they decided to make everyone who lived here through legal entry or born here, citizen. So women all became citizens even if they weren't given political or legal rights, which eventually they fought for. And Napoleon is well known. The French, when they went to their independence movement from monarchy in 1789, they used citizenship right away. Because in both cases, Americans and Frenchmen, they didn't want to be subjects. Two words they wanted to get rid of: king and subjects. So remove those, and we'll stick with the state apparatus so long as we rename it a republic and rename the residents as citizens. The United Nations, which we'll be speaking of a little bit later, has developed all kinds of agencies and regional associations that pursue and encourage transnational activity. There are negative aspects to this transnational reality: corruption, illegal transfer of money, cyber theft, gangs, drug cartels, militias, ideological exchanges that lead to conflicts, the sale and distribution of weapons. Some would say nobody's safe in a transnational reality because there's nobody in charge, and that's a question mark. So if we look at the impact of transnationalism on states, we see that the current war between Russia and Ukraine is very much a necessary focus of analysis. In this case, usually those who are calling upon sovereignty and territorial integrity are seen as kind of negative and holding on to their own interests and all. But in this case, the good guys are calling upon territorial integrity, which once in a while you hear in the news, that that's part of the issue of the war. Russia is violating the territorial integrity of the state of Ukraine. You find resistance of states to international norms, such as currently the effort to distribute humanitarian aid. The president of Syria made his speech a week ago about, well, nothing's coming in unless it comes to Damascus and the Syrian government takes control of it and it decides who's going to get any kind of aid. And the humanitarian groups resisted that. The UN resisted that. And there was a fascinating statement by the UN Secretary General this week who said to the Syrian government's resistance, when it comes to humanitarian necessity, the superior principle is the universal principle, and it has supremacy over any government authority, and that's about as far as you can imagine for the Secretary General to say, look, the transnational authority has superiority over the national authority. The resistance of the Chinese government over imported movies is kind of interesting. This was a big issue about 3 years ago. They started to complain about American-made and French-made movies coming in, which were very popular, and they thought that they were a source of rebellion, resistance, and too filled with immoral activities. So they've decided to make their own movies, and so they've almost completely replaced imported movies with theirs. So those are just some thoughts and some guide points to discovering this new reality, transnationalism, and Maurice is going to elaborate it.
Thank you, Carolyn. One of the themes for the year for the Institute of World Culture here is interdependence. And certainly when it comes to transnational economics, there is a lot of evidence for that interdependence, at least at one level. But it seems to be, in this student's mind, very fragile. And because it is not based on any real true assumptions about what economics truly is. So with that opening, we might ask ourselves a question which the Institute actually had a program on many years ago. And that question is, what is true wealth? And everyone might answer that differently, right? Everyone might say, some people might say a big house and a nice car. Others might say a stable, happy family. But others might take more of an inward definition of looking at something like happiness, or maybe even contentment. And of course, what's true is what's more permanent. What's more fleeting or everlasting may be true in the moment, but it tends to move away very quickly. And so when we take a look at the way we look at economic interdependence, it seems that as we move further into our political economy of interdependence, it seems that we draw further away from even asking these questions, let alone considering them both for our own sanity as well as for the sanity of humanity. And so that's really what I'm going to be speaking about and where transnational economics seems to fit in. So obviously, again, just to emphasize, when we talk about interdependence, we have to talk about for whom and for what. And for the most part, we've grown up over the past 100 or 200 years, most people in the modern world, with the notion that that implies economic growth and that implies unilinear progress, that you're making progress when you've earned more than your parents did. That's progress, linear progress. And so we want to examine that. Now, the political economy of interdependence is based on trade and exchange and a sense of reciprocity. And in the early modern period, the very early modern period, before mature capitalism, Thomas Paine wrote in The Rights of Man, Part 2, that there could be no such thing as a nation flourishing alone in commerce. She can only participate, and the destruction of any part of it necessarily affects all. So he was acknowledging right off the bat that trade and commerce between nations would be very, very important. And the reasons are partly because it's a better alternative to war. That is, instead of having competition for resources and competition for empires and competition for this and for that, why not trade and set up a global trading realm? And that idea has continued to surface throughout the last 100 or 200 years in this way. And that kind of trade not only benefits people and their quality of life, at least in the material plane, but along with that comes a road and a pattern of exchange of culture. So that, for example, the East India Company, the British East India Company, when they came from India, came to Boston Harbor. And when they came to Boston Harbor, they brought with them a few books. One of the books they brought from India was the Bhagavad Gita. And it was a book that Emerson and the later transcendentalists were able to then read. They were able to obtain it. And this is way before the internet, of course, right? And so trade and commerce, whether it was the old Silk Road or more modern trade and commerce, brought with it the exchange of ideas and the exchange of diversity and the exchange of culture as well. Now, that kind of early modern liberal view of trade, however, has been eclipsed with what we have really the legacy now of, which is basically a legacy of neoliberalism, where again, economic growth is the goal. And we've had a lot of cycles of economic trade and economic globalization, but none were so accelerated by the microelectronics revolution and by the 24/7 economy. And these were coalesced into the political economy of both America and the UK, and then the rest of the world in different ways. And this notion of neoliberalism changes the role of government a bit, because the role of government becomes, under neoliberalism, making the world not safe for democracy, but safe for democratic elitism of global trade. How do we make the world safe for global trade so there's frictionless trade and exchange that goes on? Now, what did this mean? Well, it meant that national barriers to international trade went down, like tariffs. At the same time, there was a large labor force movement that occurred because the internal barriers in different countries and between countries of people moving from different cities and different states to other states to where the jobs were, especially the new microelectronic and computer kind of jobs, right? Who we now call high tech, I guess. All of those barriers came down. So for example, in Europe, and in expanded Europe, which included Eastern Europe, you got this transnational economics, this transnational job seeking, where you could find many people from Poland working in England. And they didn't have the barriers and the visas and all of that fee. They could just literally hop on the Eurail and go find a job in another country. May not have been that simple, but it facilitated moving people in that way. So this emphasis on global trade was also emphasized by the keeping interest rates low, because when the cost of money is low, people will borrow money and will risk it entrepreneurially in different businesses or in real estate or in something that they think might grow in value. And so there's a tremendous kind of rush and almost competition to begin to become entrepreneurs and create an entrepreneurial society all over the world. And so people were trading stock all over the world 24/7. So whether they were doing it in Singapore and Hong Kong, whether they're doing it in San Francisco and LA and in New York, London, it was 24/7, you know? And what this created then was this culture that wanted to move, and we had the tremendous movements of people, not just refugees, but actually people moving from different nations to try to better themselves, whatever their immigration status might be. But you had this, again, wanting to see something better, and a lot of it was economic opportunity in this way. But all this created a culture then where individuals and firms were groomed to go for the highest rate of return, to be part of a corporation, usually, or a small business, and to be part of a risk society, where now the risk fell not on the organization going bankrupt, but also the individual not having a job. And so individuals would move from job to job under the guise of lifelong learning, right? But this glorification then and political socialization of production and consumption socialized the whole society and somewhat of the whole world, but fortunately not all of it, just part of it, in this global trade, in this neoliberalism. Now, there were some benefits, major benefits, and that is, it was said that vast amounts of people, particularly in China and India and other places, who are below the poverty line or living just below it, then began to, as more jobs occurred, because they were selling products more cheaply to the United States, who was consuming them, more jobs were created in all different kinds of countries, and it pulled a lot of people out just above the poverty line. And it gave a lot of people kind of middle class, if you want to call it, aspirations for more education, where before, in their cultures and in their social structures, it didn't seem like they had much of a chance. So this then created a race to the bottom for wages. And while computer chips went, and jobs and industries then began to move to more specialized places around the world where it became cheaper and more specialized to produce components of a product. And Carolyn already alluded to automobiles. The computer chip went from the USA to Guadalajara, where wages were 25% of American wages. And Guadalajara is planning to be the microchip capital of the world, until China came to produce microchips. And then all that business and all those firms left Mexico and went to China. Now we can say that it's a race to the bottom, but for those individuals who got those jobs, those were lifesavers for their families. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in that way. And those jobs, of course, are now going to Bangladesh and Vietnam. So this race for global efficiency provided a lot of movement in terms of people and transnational economics. Also, international trade was interesting because in today's global economy, 30% of all trade are really goods and services that are exported as final products to consumers abroad. In reality, 70% of all international trade today involves global value chains, or we call them supply chains, right? As services, raw materials, parts, and components move from one country to another. In Germany, Volkswagen sells 40% of their cars to China. And there are 46 industrial firms in Germany that rely on intermediate inputs from China. So we're really becoming very, very interdependent and very coupled economically. And let's not forget our own California and Los Angeles, where our biggest ports of entry, Los Angeles and San Pedro, rely on immigrant labor, but have become job factories, because for each product that comes in, it's stopped someplace else by a trucker or on rail for improvements here before it goes to the East Coast to be sold. So all this really created this tremendous specialization. World trade was 25% of gross national product in 1971. In 2010, it was 60%. It's now settling in at about 50% of gross national product, at least for the United States. Yet there is a destructive quality to this global casino of trade, because regulations and regulatory systems and the common good and the common good earth have been neglected. And pretty soon we've all seen the tremendous ecological disasters that are moving and have come from this. Even the Amazon is down to less than 25% of what it was. And so you've got a situation where not only was there so much extraction of resources from the environment, but also the acculturation of citizens to produce and consume more of this at the same time. And this then created the final tier of difficulty, because we now have essentially a very big asset economy. Inequality has emerged because for those fortunate individuals who had assets, they could borrow with low interest rates against those assets to get more assets. So those that wanted to get more and more, who had the assets to begin with or inherited a lot of money if they were fortunate, didn't earn it, but inherited it, they were the ones that, if they played the game, could become very wealthy. In fact, on a global scale, the richest 1% grabbed 2/3 of all new wealth, worth 42 trillion, created since 2020. Almost twice as much money as the bottom 99% of the world's population. During the past decade, the richest 1% had captured around half of all new wealth. All of this then has created, as you probably know, political backlash and polarization between the educated and the non-educated, between those that live in these corporate, culturally literate cities and rural areas that have their own traditional culture, but who have been forgotten in many cases and have been actually hollowed out. And a lot of things have been hollowed out in this way. And so you're starting to see now a de-globalization movement. It's small, and it's also being coupled by a change in the way people are looking at the nation state. It's not just liberalism versus nationalism and doing things for the national interest, but we're now seeing the rise of civilizational states, states that claim they have somewhat of true values that are historical, that are embedded deep in the culture, and there's starting to be a perception that it's less about democracy or authoritarianism or this or that. That's a second important, but a secondary aspect to the state representing cultural values in a civilization. So Western values, particularly freedom of speech that allows a lot of low life to occur and to be broadcast all over the place, including to children, very accessibly. A lot of individuals and governments in different cultures just don't want that. And so they want to have a different kind of civilization. So people are looking and grabbing for something, but this very economics, global economics, has actually unmoored everyone and has made everyone less secure and less stable and more jockeying around for position and more insecure. All of this then could be summarized as Gandhi did, that essentially the earth has enough to meet everyone's needs, but not enough for everyone's greed. And so underlying this motivation is the combination of both insecurity and this kind of greed. And it's become an infectious virus. And the news media, of course, picks it up as well as social media. To change the pace, though, how can we gain our sanity back? There are two books that we're celebrating the 50th year. One is called Limits to Growth, which warned in the 1970s that we're extracting too much and that we are really reaching the limits of this unlimited unilateral path to progress for economic growth. because there would be limitations to fossil fuels and limitations to their impact on the environment. And another book was Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher, who led the ground to say we should have, as the Dalai Lama has said, look at human values, not economic values. Now, the interesting thing about both of these books, which we may have ignored, is that they're both based on ancient wisdom. It isn't just somebody came up with this, or it's not just something Gandhi did that was picked up by Schumacher, basically, and, you know, small is beautiful, right? Limits to growth, we've had a whole philosophical tradition about limits and excess in different religions, and also by Pythagoras. How can we shave excess? How can we become more in balance? So limits to growth forces us to think about these things, to ask questions. What do you do when you face a limit? You can consider to barge ahead and take whatever consequences there may be, right? Or what do you do? Do you stop? Do you rethink, reformulate? But even if you stop and desist, you need some creative imagination, some values that you still want to pursue when you do reach a limit. But have we really seriously asked those questions? And the same really could be said for Small is Beautiful by Schumacher, that he suggests that a number of things. One, that we should go back and strengthen our villages and our village life, much like Gandhi would say villages should become more self-reliant, not totally, but put people first to make sure everyone in the village has enough to eat and has enough caring, has enough loving kindness. But he also suggests that we can develop intermediate technologies that help the village, that are affordable, accessible, and useful to sustain the villages and their self-reliance. And finally, he's very clear about this. It's kind of astounded me. He suggests we need a new metaphysics, that the metaphysics and ethics we have are just much too hollow now. And we need something that's more, that will push us in an economics of permanence, rather than all this, what I just talked about, all this rushing around and doing this, that, and the other thing. And the question is, have people really thought about using metaphysics and ethics not as some intellectual thing or airy-fairy philosopher's thing, but what is our ground of being? What are the values that are in our heart that we're attuned to, that give us a moral compass, that give us a moral value, rather than just responding to this, that, and the outside. So these two books, even though they were written in the 1970s, are really tremendous guides to rethinking our economy. And so we do need a revolution of values in our economy. And so we need to think of interdependence from the inside out. We need to go inside and look at our subjectivity, ourselves as subjects, as potential agents, as subjects, and think about what are our values and what is going to create something that we consider to be more permanent, and something more that we could center ourselves around to create a more permanent and humane and inclusive economic system. And people say, well, Buckminster Fuller said we need a 100% solution. And he laid it out in his book, you know, the geodesic dome and things like that. Gandhi and Gandhian ashrams were places where those people that were drawn could learn about nonviolence, learn about a different value system, learn about contributing to the whole in the village. Now that's a tough thing for Western folks to do because you have to give up your ego. And even with Indian people, it's hard, because when you have to work with other people, you know how that is, right? But the fact is that he was doing it for that to be the bedrock of the nation. That's the only way he saw India, colonialized or independent later, as being able to go back to its traditional values, go back to its traditional harmony, go back to its traditional peacefulness and tolerance and civility through learning nonviolence. But you can't learn it just in a book or by listening to a talk. You actually have to practice it. And so this becomes then the basis of kind of a new kind of economy, in a sense, where everyone's accounted for, where there is inclusion and there is responsibility. So I would like to close, if I can find it, here we go, with one of the co-founders of the Institute and what she had to say. Poverty, her name Nandini Iyer, poverty, Plato pointed out, consists not in the decrease of our possessions, but in the unending proliferation of our wants. I'll say that again. Poverty, Plato pointed out, consists not in the decrease of our possessions, but in the unending proliferation of our wants. We could at least reflect on this seriously instead of rejecting it out of hand. Freedom, says Spinoza, is the recognition of necessity. When we give in to our insatiable desires, we are not expressing our free will, but our slavery, our bondage to passions. We need to realize that freedom consists not only in the ability to get what we desire or to do whatever we want, but in the ability to confront ourselves, the freedom to deny our desires and not to do what we would like to do. Plato, Shankara, and Spinoza all believe that we are least free when we impulsively give in to our passions, when we do whatever we feel like doing. We are most our true selves, most actively exercising our authority and free will when we refuse to submit mindlessly to our desires. The Taoists declared that the sage is the most powerful person in the world precisely because he does not give in to his desires, because he wants nothing for himself. These paradoxes may again point to obvious truths we have chosen to ignore. And so we might remind ourselves that a crucial element of the deepest morality is the ability to expand the horizon of our compassionate understanding, to emphasize with those we regard as adversaries, to put ourselves in the place of the individual we have harshly condemned. To open up our minds and hearts in this way is to begin to practice tolerance, humility, and magnanimity, the keys to the practice of the golden rule in every religion.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on one point you made, that somehow we needed to bring moral perspectives, and you've just had a wonderful quote, into our interdependence as well as what we do at home. Do you think that transnationalism is capable, with so much freedom and diversity, is capable of developing moral principles or a moral perspective, or not?
Oh. Well, I think it's certainly possible to do that. because you find in different cultures, including indigenous cultures and traditions throughout the world, that they all seem to have a kinship with each other. They all seem to have ideas about ecology, about saving the earth, about replenishing the water and the soil. They may go about it differently, but they have the same kinship toward it, a more holistic view of a vertical as well as horizontal axis of interdependence, where they revere their elders, which is what Pythagoras says the first thing to do before you start something is to revere the gods first. There is a vertical interdependence of reverence, of humility, that we don't know it all, et cetera, and that there can be, and has been shown on the earth to be, a kinship through many indigenous cultures and many religions. And that can form the basis of a transnational and, in fact, an emergence of a world culture.
Thank you. Do you need a short break, or should we go on with discussion?
Are we going to take questions now?
Yeah.
I just wanted to, if somebody has a question for the sake of streaming, we want them to use the mic.
Okay. So do we need the lights on?
Some light.
Anyone have any comments, questions?
No, I have a comment and a question.
That's okay.
Following up what Maurice mentioned about quoting Gandhi, Spinoza, and Plato on freedom, my head pops up then. Leo Tolstoy said, freedom is granted to those who are powerful and strong, unfortunately. And following up what you're saying, I wanted to ask you about, you said there's 60% of international trade was in sevens, and now it's about 50%, correct?
Yes.
What's the national production now? Has that stayed same? Has it gone up or has it decreased?
Well, the height of international trade and global trade, according to one statistic, and you can find so many different statistics on so many different things, so don't take this as anything but just an indicator, not a fact even, is that I think we went to a high of 60%, but then after the COVID periods, and a kind of a deglobalization movement, a populist movement in different countries of people being left out and hollowed out, that it's kind of moved to about 50% right now. And your first question was about the power, or Tolstoy's comment?
Only to the comment, and then following up your freedom. But well, how about national production? Or international trade, but now the national made in America products.
Oh.
Is that going up or down or stay the same?
That's a good question. I don't know the exact answer to that. Whether
Isn't that a national movement to make American products now?
It is, yeah. But I don't have that, I simply don't have that statistics. I don't want to speculate on that.
Okay.
When you're talking about values, you mentioned what is true wealth.
Yeah.
Well, wasn't it Gautama Buddha said that contentment is the greatest wealth?
Yeah.
So, I wonder how many people subscribe to that idea, and what kind of difference do you think it would make in global interdependence? To think about that value.
Well, I think it would make a big difference to global interdependence, because if people are content, they don't feel like they have to have something from somebody else. They don't have to acquire anything from someone else. They're fulfilled, so to speak, and they're satisfied, And that would really help, because then you could help other people who who may, because of different circumstances throughout the world, and it's very diverse, that it would be much easier in human solidarity. Now, the humanitarian response to Ukraine is a worldwide outrage and a humanitarian response, and through this transnational economics and this globalized idea where it comes in your living room every night, right? People have an emerging sense of human solidarity and human values that they see being trampled. Now, that doesn't, unfortunately, it's going on other places too, and we won't. And so a lot of times, maybe only one particular event gets all the publicity, right? But if people are more content with what they have, they can be more thoughtful about how to help. And it's the lack of creative imagination, the lack of thought, and lack of deliberation of how to pull together. But as Carolyn said, and she gave so many examples and can probably give others, of all these NGOs and all these groups that have gotten together. So there is, while these organizations may seem separate, underneath it, there is a sense that we are one human family, that the suffering that has come out of this separateness and selfishness and greed and unnecessary violence has so affected human beings, including younger generations, that there's just more of a sense of the human family and a more of a sense of human solidarity. And it's emerging out of the surface. Carolyn?
Yeah, I happen to have the view that one of the reasons there's all these rushes to weird scenarios in this country and opposition to government without any recognition of what governments do important things. And it's not just build highways and bridges and print money, but they don't have any meaning in their life. They get through high school where everybody can go to the sock hops and whatever. And they have these, the cell phones and all, but somehow this culture isn't even giving them the question, well, what would be a meaningful life? What would nourish me? What would give me purpose and aims? And so that's a cultural problem that I think is very, very needing to be addressed. And that when there's two things that transnationalism offers. One is an expanded opportunity. I remember having a student who lived in Camarillo who went to work at 9 o'clock, but her work was in Asia. But she just thought that was a wonderful opportunity, but also just meeting people. People go on these river cruises, which I can't see how they can afford, but somehow transnationalism does give opportunities for more meaningful and enthusiastic attitudes towards life and towards others. So I think that's important. And unfortunately, what is our news? The quality of news, and there's just been these revelations about how Cox let their reporters go on and report lies, know they were lies, but it was part of the competition for getting people. If they didn't have negative things and all that, then the viewers would go to some other smaller broadcast medium, which would probably be better for them. So I would think, and I think Maurice has addressed this so wonderfully, that at some point we have to ask the question, what kind of inner experience can be developed? And some would say Well, transnationalism can do that. You know, you encounter another religion, you talk to other people, and the world isn't so threatening when you can actually talk to other people. I once, 2 months ago or 3 months ago, I had an AOL need, and this woman at 3 in the morning really helped me because bad guys had gotten in. And then at the end, I asked her where she was from, and she said Ukrainia, Romania. And I'd never spoken or seen anybody from Romania. So it was just a nice thought to think that, you know, and she was very skilled. And I've later since discovered that AOL has a huge team of technicians based in Romania. So I think it's a quality. There is human. I guess what is it that kind of stirs something within us? The stories about children and being brought out, or that people are finding ways to address some of these concerns that governments are still hemming and hawing. Well, I don't think we can afford that, et cetera. So I would encourage us to find ways in which human beings, you know, just see meaning, if nothing else, that the possibility of learning. Learning is a very good source of positive contentment, seems to me.
What if we posited the fact that we are interdependent and that we're just discovering how we are interdependent, that we're not separate to begin with, that our bodies, our minds, are not separate from, those forms are different, but we're not really separate from each other. We're in fact come from the same source, and certainly there's a lot of scientific evidence that we have all kinds of elements in our bodies from other people, from other planets, literally. So maybe if we start with the idea that we are interdependent, and how can we be more responsive, in other words, how to take responsibility where we, in our own daily rounds, that can create a different kind of social system, a different kind of economics, and one that'll link us to others across the globe that are doing the same.
Well, this is amazing. The question that arises is, we see now the interdependence of labor, workers working everywhere. And also we see not only workers working everywhere, but also we see a lot of exploitation. So the question that arises is, given that migration of labor is a fact, and it is pointed out that many of the wealthy nations, they are growing older and they will need young people, and most of them will be coming from the third world. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how should we view the national states? Is there any meaning to it, given this interdependence in terms of labor, in terms of everything? What can you say? What's the solution?
I'd like to address that. Okay. There was an article in the New York Times recently about how it was focused on a woman who was managing a farm, I forgot what she grew, in England and in the rural areas of England. And she had prospered by when Britain was part of the European Union. And part of it was the free flow of labor. I think she happened to employ a lot of people from Poland or someplace who had come and settled, some as a group, on her farm. And they had stayed there and built a community. So they were content because they had jobs and they had income. but they also had community in a sense of their own culture and diet and things like that. And she was happy because they were being very productive and skilled. And with the exit from Brexit and the need to have immigration papers and all that, many of those workers had to disappear. And so she was working with a skeleton staff. Her income went way down. She was totally frustrated because basically through a vote that has lots of question marks about it, Britain had removed itself from a strong interaction with the global economy. So it's how we look at immigration. And some of it was, you know, the idea that there were rules that you had to follow and all of that. But I do think that that's what we should be looking towards, is that people could move, but they would not be just hanging around London looking for odd jobs, or they wouldn't be exploited, but they could actually become a constructive part of the community, which, and that's now statistically very obvious, I sometimes remind people, well, who's going to clean the hotel rooms in Los Angeles if you get rid of all the immigrants? But that's where we have to become more mature and not allow this terrible exploitation that is a shadow side of transnationalism, but to see it in, again, a positive and actually give more the statistics. And now more and more people in England are seeing the mistake the Brexit vote was, because it has shrunk their own economic productivity. But someone else might have a comment on that, or you might.
Well, I can just comment briefly that I think people, again, are showing their conscience. There's movements throughout the United States for fair pay for service workers and fast food workers. And it hasn't caught hold of everyone, but it is starting to get in the news media. And I think that part of the moral responsibility that citizens will have in the future, because there are people that are still greedy, you know, et cetera, is to be able to be willing to take Gandhi-like action if necessary, or like Martin Luther King did. And so we should, in our education, appreciate not only the values of Gandhi and King, but also their practice. But one thing about doing nonviolent action is you need training. Just going out on the street and protesting may or may not have anything. I mean, it just comes and it goes, right? I don't know how many protests we've had in the past year on all these issues, you name it. But when you train a group in nonviolence, and where each individual has taken a vow to act with loving kindness toward others, is another word for nonviolence, and to discipline themselves in that way. And once you have people who have taken individually some vows, who are getting trained, a lot of these injustices then can really be confronted in a more active way. And that's one of the things that we, even though we have a lot of demonstrations in the United States, for example, it's really that concerted nonviolent effort over time that can produce results, or at least did.
Okay. Since you brought up that the protests, that's definitely should be on the list of transnationalism. Remember Black Lives Matters? And we were all horrified, rightly so, and produced initially protests all over this country. But what was the total surprise for many is that suddenly protests emerged all over the world using the slogan Black Lives Matter even though the group that they might be trying to defend was some other ethnic or racial group. But that was the shock, and that makes government leaders shiver in their boots, that how suddenly so many thousands of people and so many different kinds of nations were responding in support. That seems threatening, and despite the fact that they may not be able to do anything to get change in their country because of a tyrannical government, they are building support, and if it can, which is better organized, and if it can be, if there can be leadership within various countries to develop the nonviolence and a moral perspective that Maurice is speaking of, that maybe that's going to come. It's just going to take a few more decades.
This is a challenging question. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said the three biggest problems facing the planet today are 1, the refugee crisis, 2, wage disparity, and 3, ecology and climate change. How should we solve those?
Go ahead. You take one and I'll take one.
Well, I think we need to take a more Gandhian approach, which involves social action. I remember in the Institute of World Culture sponsored a Gandhian social worker to come here, and at La Casa de Maria actually had a 5-day Gandhian ashram-like experience. And we had speakers talking like we've been talking and this and that, and, you know, satyagraha and all that kind of stuff. But in the end, the Gandhian social worker said, you all know the theory, you know Gandhi so well. But I don't hear anybody doing anything about it. What are you doing in your community? What are you planning to do? So I think we need to raise awareness. Awareness is critical. The revolutions in the past came with other kinds of elements, but the revolution really now is a revolution in awareness. And the more awareness and then the more inspiration one has to act on the basis of that awareness, that I think that could begin to handle a lot of these problems. There are specific policy approaches which would take each one would take a seminar to answer this. But I do think that in general, drawing a larger circle in our mind, in our hearts, and putting our mind back together with our hearts rather than separating them so often. Our heart means our wisdom, our conscience, acting from universal principles so we can have a humanitarian ideal, as Carolyn was pointing out, in our hearts that's active. And so we may not be able to handle every problem all the time, but these humanitarian problems are going to continue until we get a new metaphysical perspective, a new paradigm. And I really suggest revisiting Small is Beautiful by E.L. Schumacher, and he explicitly gives a metaphysical paradigm about the sun and the light and all that as part of what you have to do. Carolyn?
Well, I'll tackle the refugee problem. It's really been a test, particularly a few years ago, when so many were flowing and trying to flow into Europe, and we still have many. Obviously, the one point of focus is to for governments to encourage other governments, for NGOs to encourage other NGOs to develop the economic and social opportunities in the countries the refugees are fleeing to. because as I can remember a woman who came from Africa and, was surviving in Italy, but she wasn't particularly happy. Her life in a city in Italy was not full of, there's consumer opportunities and all. But anyway, and that can be happy, and that can happen through our foreign policy in aid, our more support for NGOs to go into countries that need help, which they're doing. But it's like our own government is so resistant and afraid of criticism. You're giving money to, other people, what about us? And we're all familiar with the negativity that seems to constantly come out of our own country's government and political. Don't blame all the government leaders, because there are some fantastic people working in government. So we need to kind of like take a different attitude. But we also need to take a different attitude towards immigration. We need immigration. We've benefited for 400 years from immigration, and that nothing's ever been done about the DACA people. I mean, that's shameful. So I think that it's just some basic changes in attitude and policy we need, and that comes back to seeing that we are interdependent, and actually these human beings aren't different from us. They have the same needs, and they can become good citizens. And yes, there's some that will fail. So I think it's a attitudinal change, and the leadership is afraid to do this because if they're caught trying to give some praise to an immigrant, then they're kind of worried about getting reelected. And it's just, and I think the rest of the world recognizes that there's a attitude change in America that's been there for a long time, and it's just shameful that we can't change it. So.
I didn't hear too much about the third thing, ethical or environmental crisis or climate chaos. That was the third factor in the Dalai Lama's comments.
Well, I think it probably comes down to consuming less, using less fossil fuels. There are a lot of things that individuals can do by themselves to to lessen some of these conditions to begin with. Obviously, we know that people now are going to plant-based diets, maybe because of health reasons or other reasons, but the fact is that eating meat and what its implications are for grain, what its implications are for the whole environment, that just reducing that somewhat can make a big difference in the environment. So I think that there are different ways in which we could just live small is beautiful and reduce our consumption and be more mindful of our choices. Also, I think we can rediscover our communities. Who is in your sugar borrowing community? Who would you borrow sugar from? Tonight, you need sugar or something more healthy. Who would you borrow it from? Your neighbor, who you'd call your family? That's the sugar borrowing community, right? And then what about your small neighborhood, like down the street, the mom and pop store, the beauty shop, the whatever? What about those? And then what about community of place, which is more like maybe a population of 30,000 or so, plus or minus, where, for example, you have districts like here in Santa Barbara, Montecito, but you also have other places of 10,000 people or more. And what if we created an ecological footprint for each district? Not for the whole city of Santa Barbara, which is 100,000 people, or the city of Los Angeles or something, but would you respond if you saw the footprint, the ecological footprint of your neighborhood? And I suspect that people would start to respond. And I do think if people can do recycling, even though it's gotten kind of complicated lately, that people could respond to this. But they do need a little bit of incentive and information, and we do need to rediscover communities of place and make them much more viable in our life. They do exist, and we talk about them, because when someone says, oh, you live in Santa Barbara, well, where in Santa Barbara? And when you say the where in Santa Barbara, that means there's a community of place. It used to be a zip code, a real estate development, whatever it is, it has a name. And we've forgotten all about that as a place where people can get together and organize around proper values, and that includes ecological values as well.
You know, you're doing such a great job. I have another question that was sparked. Many people that I talk to say, look, there's 8 billion people on the planet now. It doesn't matter what I do. I'm just one person. What can one person do?
You got an answer?
Do you have an answer?
No, answer that question.
Oh, okay. You want to take it?
Well, first of all, a lot of things are started by one person. What about the 2 women in Vermont that got very concerned about landmines that had been left in African countries? And they went over and started to organize the removal of those landmines, which were killing residents and children and all that. And they built the whole movement, so to speak, just of ordinary folks. And they ended up getting a Nobel Peace Prize for it, which they hadn't expected. So there's almost everything starts with one person. And also remember that each person has thoughts. Each person has feelings. And if they're cultivating that within themselves, that can have an influence even if they're not organizing anybody. They don't quite know what to do. And they can certainly use speech constructively to talk about what needs to be done. We shouldn't have to have a horrible war in Ukraine to remind us of the problem of greed and violence and all of that. So I think if one person, if you give some thought to it, well, what could I do? Is it a neighborhood project? Is it a letter writing or you can write letters even on the internet. So is it something that I could try to just simply circulate questions or concerns about? You have to find your focus, and there's some things that that you kind of feel, well, that's not my issue, but there's always something that you could do. And I always remember the Dalai Lama has used repeatedly the remedy for a lot of things, loving kindness. So maybe trying to cultivate loving kindness that can help one more person, 2 more people kind of feel that contentment we're speaking of. So I think it means that you don't do excuses, and you don't let fear, anything you can do to reduce fear and anxiety in you and the people around you is helpful. Want to say anything?
Yeah, well, I'll just add that what can one person do? Well, one person can look at their daily rounds. How do you get up in the morning? Are you grouch? What kind of a social atmosphere? We know that when you've heard, well, someone entered the room and it all lit up. Well, you don't have to be a charismatic person, but you can uplift the very social environment. You can be cheerful, even when you're sad. You could still be cheerful to someone else. So by thinking about others first, by cultivating an altruistic attitude, but you have to practice it. Love in the abstract isn't going to cut it. You have to practice it concretely. So there's so much that individuals can do. And one can start just with their daily round. And the great thing about it is you're not going to be successful very much. So you're going to learn. And sometimes a little bit of suffering maybe enters in there. But then you're going to learn and think. And it's through wisdom and compassion, as the Dalai Lama says, that we could really exude beneficence in the world.
Yeah, I hope I can get my what I think out clearly. One thing it make me think a lot is people can do a lot of things if they have time to think. But in this community or people I start to meet when my husband was in assisted living, memory assistant place, I found out all the workers there, almost all of them have to work 2 or 3 jobs. We are very fortunate we can sit down and talk about things, but a lot of people in this country really don't have time to even think. They have to, first of all, take care of their housing, rent. That's why I'm reading a lot about housing in Santa Barbara now. The state mandate that we need to have housing for the lower or middle class income. Now I found out even this week's Independence, some teachers even have to take up a second job because they cannot afford rents. And then this is a real problem, and this could be solved. It's something more visible than a lot of big theories. This is a real problem, and we are in a community, but for several years, Santa Barbara County cannot come up with a plan to build enough housing for the working class. So just like last week, 2 weeks ago, the Monday rain, a lot of places have to close. I went to the bank, then Bank of America said 3 branches, only 1 can open because nobody can come from Ventura to work because the highway is closed. And school has to close because teachers cannot come. And I don't know how it affects the hospital. So I was thinking how to solve the problem, that we can solve real problem instead of talking all the protests and everything. Some people even try to say, they compare the liberalism, people who's progressive thinking and liberal thinking, to the religious fanatics. They just talk. They think what will be done, but nothing is done. Nothing is being done.
Well,
So,
the state of California actually is trying to do something, and they are requiring once a year, I believe it is, every community, every county or city government to put forth that they've assigned them, you know, you need to build 2,050 new low-income housing get started next year. And so recently, I don't know, they mentioned Magnolia Plaza. I don't know what they mean by that. But in other words, they are requiring now communities to plan for and build low-income housing. Because, I mean, fortunately, I used to commute, but the opposite direction. So just no problem. But the lineup, you know, coming in the morning, going out, it's backed up from Santa Barbara City all the way to Ventura. So there is a recognition that they have to do that, even if people say, well, I don't want that kind of person living in my community. Well, they're working for you, they're taking care of you in the hospital, et cetera, et cetera. So there is public policy being developed. And maybe there's big snags in it, I don't know, but at least there's some kind of commitment.
If you read the article in Independence last week, is a really detailed about what should be done, and Santa Barbara County cannot meet the deadline. They're supposed to be February 15th to show what zoning. You have to do zoning, and then now they said the last. They want to put things in paper and not really want to do it. Is to rezone the agricultural land to residential. So it's just, I'm just thinking there are things we can talk about big theories, but something is so simple and it's so important, but it seems that we cannot solve that problem.
Well, it's complicated to build housing.
Well, I think we do have a problem in America, not just the Santa Barbara, a rich community, it makes it a bigger problem, right? Everyone wants to live in a nice, rich community. But our rents are too high, and we know that we have many discrepancies between richer people, a lot of whom have inherited their house, by the way, from their parents, and those people who have come, who might be service workers to other communities. So it's a very difficult problem, and unless we do something about rents, and I'm not suggesting rent control, but that would be one approach. And by the way, Santa Monica, city of Santa Monica, which is about a little bit larger than Santa Barbara, up until recently did have a pretty good rent control model. And then another practical thing that isn't just talking, although it sounds like it's just talking, is having a guaranteed minimal income for lower income people. And that's been talked about for 25 years, and it's been studied for 25 years, and experiments have gone on for 25 years. Well, the city of Los Angeles has, and Chicago, I think, now have an experimental program of giving cash grants to low-income people. But we're deathly afraid of giving cash grants and let people choose to get in their situation, to be more creative about how they can use their resources to live and survive and cooperate with other people. Because if you're getting $500 and you're getting $500, now you got $1,000 to play with in terms of how you can cooperate with each other. So it starts to create flexibility. That's not a panacea to the problem you pointed out, but those are some approaches.
I'd like to, does someone want a question? No, go ahead, if you has a question.
We're talking about transnationalism and interdependence, globalization, and all the benefits of it. And that's great, but I can't stop thinking also what Maurice mentioned about China nationalizing their movies and the movement of, like I asked before, the United States trying to make American products more than depending on international products. So to me, I see nationalism growing as well in other parts of the globe. Obviously, right now, Russia is not playing fair with neighbors. Israel is not playing very fair with their own neighbors. India has the biggest Bollywood, which is bigger than Hollywood movies. The automobile industry in India is bigger than the entire world. Tata, the company, the largest in the world.
Yeah.
China has its own national automobile production as well. We just don't buy that product in America. So my question to you is, we're talking about what we're talking about, but in the aspect of political aspect, economical aspect, social aspect, environmental aspect, is this nationalism that we're talking about, or transnationalism, either one of both? My question is it growing parallel, all four, or many other aspects? We can count many. Or some are growing faster than others, some have come to a halt, some have slowed down, and some actually probably decreasing. Any ideas, any thoughts for either one of you?
Go ahead, because I couldn't really hear the
Yeah.
question.
Well, I think that a lot of times we do have contradictory trends going on at the same time. So while on one hand we do have kind of a sense of human solidarity, on the other hand, political polarization and nationalism is also increasing at the moment. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each one. And two, because there is some advantage about trying to make things at home and employ people at home, like your neighbors. There's some advantages to that. And so it really becomes a question of trying to balance some, you might say, pretty bad alternatives. I don't necessarily see a good alternative, but I do see that we're going to begin that we're not going to just have mindless globalization and trade among countries, but that we're going to have to think about, I think Gorbachev probably said the best thing when he said that we don't need a balance of power, we need a balance of need. So on the global level, we have to make sacrifices or compromises in order to meet different people's needs at different times, different nations' needs at different times, different people's needs at different times. So we really need not a balance of power, but we need a balancing of people's needs. And that might help regulate a little bit on a global level. And you can have a global commons, you can have, the United Nations has done very well, but we do need a global commons, a global parliament, something to really take a look at what's going on the globe, because right now, as has been alluded to, there's just a lot of anarchy going on, and then that gets to this polarization.
Speaking of the United Nations, I had intended to include some reference to it. If you hadn't picked up this one-pager, I copied the first and second page of the United Nations Charter. It's real easy to find the whole charter online. You just do text United Nations Charter, and there's several options. So you can take one home. It's full of some optimistic principles and aims. So it just kind of, it may inspire you or to see that it was an amazing creation process back there in the post-World War II. And so it was really one of the finest hours of the world community in the 20th century. And it also, they knew they had to work with member states and for all their conflicts and differences and stubbornness and whatever. But they persisted, and they did create a document that allows for one thing, just I want to mention this, it forbids a member to invade another member. It's clearly there. And so what Putin is doing is clearly a violation of the United Nations Charter, okay, and the territory. And it provides a lot of mechanisms where states can get together and try to solve their own problem or go to the Security Council. And the General Assembly is very open to what we might see as more idealistic or creative opportunities. The problem in the Security Council, as everybody knows, is Russia is the veto power, and the U.S. has used it too. So, but it's nonetheless, despite its inability to muster, and they didn't create the military commission that they were going to and all that, but the leadership has, every week, the leadership is on the news at least twice, and during the pandemic, and actually has decided that you have to go ahead and challenge what some government is saying or doing. Speaking up in ways that were not always there, and that you have to, and then the other part of the United Nations, if they haven't been able to stop war, and they do a lot to try, and there's peacekeepers in something like 91 different countries, but they have expanded their agencies, and the staff is really, they've transformed the staff into doing things. So a lot of UN activity is coordinated with some of these other transnational activities, NGOs. They're working with NGOs and all of that. So if you're trying to fill out a picture, and a local group like the Nuclear Peace Foundation here, they can get on the list to be part of the discussion process on anything to do with nuclear weapons and all of that. So it's not very visible, but there's a lot of people working to make transnationalism constructive in some of the ways that your questions are pointing to. They're not probably going to offer a metaphysics, but I do think that it's interesting, and there's not time to read the Article 1, but don't be too pessimistic, because there are thousands of people who are working to improve the quality of life around the world. Oh, before the vote of thanks, which we're going to have, we did want to announce our next program, which is 2 weeks on March 4th. We're going to connect with the Ukrainian Institute of World Culture and hear a talk by Professor Dr. Yulia Sabanova.
Shabanova.
How do you pronounce it?
Shabanova.
So, okay. She's going to teach us about a Ukrainian philosopher, talk about getting some metaphysics into our consciousness. You want to pronounce his name?
I don't know.
Hiroria Skova-Roda, I think. Personality, and a Ukrainian philosopher about his personality and his teachings. The doctrine of balance and unequal equality, the philosophy of the heart and the doctrine of kindred work, mystical aspects of his views. The thing is that although it's at 8 p.m. in Ukraine, and it's going to be broadcast from Ukraine, it will come on at 10 a.m. in Santa Barbara. So you need to email if you want to see it live. Email Donna, D-O-N-N-A, at worldculture.org, and she will give you a link.
Only non-members.
Only non-members need. Members will get the link. Okay, one of the privileges of membership in the Institute. So it's a fascinating and unusual opportunity, and this is on, for us, it's March 3rd. Isn't that a Friday?
March 4th.
4th, yeah, this says March 4th. So this, yeah, there, but you see that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So it's Saturday, March 4th at 10 a.m. it would begin. And as
March 3 is our time, March 4 is their time.
That's a mistake.
Oh, that's a mistake.
It's a mistake, yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's not on Friday, it's on Saturday,
March 4th.
March 4th at 10 a.m. And it will be posted, I've heard, on our YouTube channel at some point. But 10 a.m. is not too early. It was going to be 8 a.m. So we certainly invite you to this unusual opportunity to be transnational in our education. So we call upon Dunson Kiplagat to give us the vote of thanks for today's program.
Well, what can we say? We have been given a lot of food to digest, assimilate, and practice with regard to the deep meaning of interdependence. Both Dr. Carolyn Dorrance and Dr. Maurice Bisheff has sort of brought us an appreciation of what astronauts in space, when they look at the Earth, they see that there's only one earth, blue earth, beautiful. You don't see any boundaries. And that we are all in the same boat. We are very thankful to both Dr. Dorrance and Dr. Bisheff for illuminating us with regard to different views of interdependence, from transnational, economic, cultural interdependence, as well as physical interdependence. We are also very grateful to them for highlighting different views of interdependence, especially with regard to what we may call horizontal interdependence, which is what we may call things-centered, material-centered values, which are really connected with self-interest and zero-sum game. That's what we also learn. But they also point out to us that there is a higher view or sense of interdependence, which is connected or human values centered, or you might say centered on universal unity, human solidarity. And they have helped us to highlight what actually Dalai Lama emphasized all the time, and that is revolution of values, where we should have values that are based on oneness of all humanity. And that on the basis of this, then, everything becomes possible. Everything is a win-win, rather than lose-lose. So we would like them to again express our appreciation for Dr. Dorrance, Carolyn Dorrance, and Maurice Bisheff for giving us these different perspectives of interdependence, but pointing out that in the end, the solution lies in assuming and having a conviction of oneness of all humanity. Nations, races, all these other categories are secondary. Thank you again.
Thank you. Well, you had marvelous levels of thought. Thank you, God.
Yvonne, so you don't get too depressed. The city of Irvine does low-income housing, and they